Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, my friend Riki Hayashi, our new co-host, and I are diving into the question of, can pirates be heroes? Can piracy be a victimless crime? We're doing this all through the lens of the One Piece show, both the anime and the recent live action, and we're going to have a lot to say about that. But first, as I said, we love listener feedback. And Riki, we got a great piece of feedback from one of our fans named Rachel, and she wrote, Rachel here, pronouns she, they. First off, I wanted to say thanks for your amazing podcast and your super speedy and in-depth coverage of Avatar. We did 2 episodes a day for 4 days, so I'm very glad to know that was appreciated. Overall, I agree with a lot of what you have said. I think the casting has been brilliant across the board, and they absolutely nailed Momo and Appa. I love getting to see scenes we never got in the original. The highlight to me was Zuko's Agni Kai with his father. I wanted to email specifically about the gender presentations and intentional choices to remove some of the misogyny from the show, as you mentioned wanting some femme perspectives. We very much do, so thank you. Overall, I've been really on board with the decision to remove Sokka's overt misogyny from the show, and I don't feel that this was a key ingredient to the story by any means. But, all in caps, I feel that in taking this out, they've also inadvertently or intentionally taking out all of the traditionally unseen and underappreciated women's labor that Katara did growing up in Wolf Cove. In the animated version, it's a key point that while Sokka has dealt with the pressure of protecting the village, Katara has been raising children, cooking and cleaning, literally Sokka's underwear, and doing invisible emotional labor for the village the whole time, too. This goes on to be a key part of her character in later seasons, when there's an arc about how her motherliness and the fact that she feels such a responsibility to be a caretaker because that's the role responsibility she had to take up at home. So while I really like the work they've done on Sokka, I really feel like they could have removed his overt misogyny without also removing aspects of the patriarchy that really actively shaped Katara's character. In short, I think they improved Sokka's character at what I think was a totally unnecessary cost to Katara's. This particular rewrite has a real written by a man vibe to it from my perspective. Having said that, I really love the show and I've already watched it twice and will likely watch it a bunch more. Sorry for the length. Don't worry, we love all the thoughts. Just had a bunch of feelings to share, and thanks so much for all you do. Love the cast and keep it up, Rachel.
Awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Rachel, for that very in-depth feedback. Um, and hello, Matthew.
Yeah.
Good to be here again.
Good to see you too. Yeah. What do you think of what Rachel had to say?
I want to briefly touch upon what they mentioned at the beginning about Zuko's Agni Kai.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's not the main point, but I agree that the action was good, and I think they've replaced an Agni Kai between Zuko and Zhao
Yeah,
with
I think
having
that's right.
more action in that one. But it was interesting to me because in this version, in the live action version, Zuko holds his own and is actually appears to be defeating Ozai and then
Right.
stops because it's his father. He's not going to do like this, not killing blow, but very harmful
Mm-hmm.
blow. And Ozai takes advantage of that and strikes back. And then that's his lesson, right? Like weakness. You can
Right.
never show weakness. And in the original animated version, Zuko doesn't even fight. He
Yeah.
just supplicates himself, bows down, and says, "It was not my intention to dishonor you, Father. Please, like, don't do this." And it was much, I don't know, it seemed like that version seemed harsher
Yeah. I can see that. I
than
can see
than
that.
this one. So it's it's a balance. I'm not sure which I like better. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I've heard opinions both ways there, but they're very different in how they portray that relationship between the two of
Yeah. I think if they had just switched it to
them.
do something different, it would have felt weird. I think Zuko and his father's relationship is just overall quite different, and so I think that this fit that interpretation. And you can decide which one you like more. Um,
Mhm.
to Rachel's main point, though, I really love it,
Yeah.
and I think you're right. For me, at least, I think as a masculine person, someone raised as a man, it is something I totally missed. And in particular, we do see in the live action at the end of the season that the women at first feel like that they shouldn't be fighters and the Qatar shouldn't be a fighter because they have a role to do too. And that there's sort of a perspective of like the men fight and we do the teaching and they're both equal. And why is Katara getting so upset about this? And that was an interesting take on it, and I think still is a very kind of sexist way of looking at it and patriarchal, but just with a more like, separate but equal kind of thing, which is bad but different than the purely hierarchical. But I think that it definitely was missing something. And I really love Rachel's point because definitely that mothering aspect that she has to take on, and also just her frustration, I think, that Sokka, we spend so much time talking about all the pressure that was on him, but no one really looks at the pressure that was on Katara, is such a big part of her character that, yeah, I think it's unfortunate that that kinda got left out as much as it did.
I completely agree with you and Rachel. I think Katara, live action Katara, is probably the character that was done the most dirty in
I
this
think so, yeah.
version in terms of all of it. I mean, we talked about her, the lack of showing her development as a waterbender, right?
Mhm.
I mean, they only showed very brief glimpses, and they left out the whole her helping to train Aang
Right.
in waterbending, which leads to her growing in her mastery. So the whole scene where she confronts Zuko at the end, and he's like, "I see you found a master," and she's like, "Yeah, it's me," was like a girl
Yeah.
boss moment as written, but did not feel earned because we did not get the sense of her
Yeah.
becoming a master. I mean, it just kind of like was very rushed, and all of that. I think like Sokka's lack of misogyny in the live action is a part of that, because seeing her grow through his lens and his respect for her change and his understanding of her change it was all part of that. So
Yeah.
no, you don't need him to be like as overtly misogynist, but I think by taking that out, by ramping that down, they have inadvertently just again like done Katara dirty as a
Yeah.
character, as in terms of her development.
Yeah.
It's
No, I
like
think
it's
that
kind of ironic.
I think it also takes a lot away from his dynamic with Suki, because again, it doesn't have to be that he's overt about it in any way. It can just be that he's internalized the teachings of his home. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's not, he was like animated Sokka. Yes, like it is a noted part of his character. But I think it was just like with Suki, it was a couple of lines like, "Oh, like women can't be warriors" or something like that, and
Yeah.
then she like throws him to the ground. It's like, "Oh, okay, wait, maybe they can."
Yeah.
And it was pretty quick. I think I believe like their interaction and his turn,
Mhm.
because the their interactions were kind of brief, but I mean, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it was missing, and it's not important to his character, but it was a part of it. So
Yeah. I think I'm more okay with not having it there, but I think that, as Rachel points out, like there's knock-on effects there that we just don't wind up seeing. So thank you, Rachel, for the great feedback. We love something like that. Please keep sending more. We'll probably do a full feedback episode at some point on Avatar. But now on to our main question. Uh, but now on to our main episode. As we talked about, as we talked about a bit last week, one thing Riki and I have really wanted to do is bring the focus of these episodes a little more back to specific questions. That was the focus for a long time. More recently, I think we've gotten into more kind of like review type stuff, which is still fun. We still may do that from time to time. And we will probably have some more review type comments about the live action One Piece in our bonus member section. But I think what we're going to be trying to do more often is take a central question of that often is very inspired by one particular piece of media and kind of go with that. And so today we want to talk about this idea of, can a pirate be a hero? Can a pirate be a, there's kind of quotes around all these terms and we talking about how we understand these terms, but can a pirate be a good guy? And we'll be doing this a lot through the lens of One Piece because, specifically in asking, specifically when I was watching One Piece, that was something I said to Riki a couple times, who had encouraged me to watch it. Was I would quote lines from Luffy about how he doesn't want to steal or hurt people, and pirates don't have to be bad people. And I was like, does this guy understand what a pirate is? Um, and I think on that joking question came this very much more serious discussion that we want to have of, because I think that the topics of piracy and heroism and how we define these things are kind of fundamental to a lot of the media we talk about. So, Riki, let me just start by, why was this the a topic you were excited about and the lens you wanted to look at One Piece through?
well, first off, because I love One Piece.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for a review, my one sentence review is It's amazing. Go watch it. Uh, but in terms of this question, I it's always fascinated, like pirates in media has fascinated me for a long time, and particularly in One Piece, like clearly Luffy is A, the protagonist, and B, the hero, right?
Right.
Because those can be different things.
Yeah.
And in fact, like he is probably one of the most heroic, altruistic protagonists we've ever seen in an animated product. Like I can't. It's hard to think of someone who is like more fundamentally good than
Yeah.
Luffy at his core. Just like his innate trust in people and belief in them, it's infectious. And I think that is one of the things I love about the product and the character is at the end of this all, he's going to find the One Piece. Like it hasn't happened yet, but like we know that's
Spoilers.
how that we know that's how the story has to end, right?
Right.
But there's a real sense that it's going to be the whole meme of the real treasure was the friends he made along the way.
Right.
Because that like already like in the first season of this live action, you can see how important his crew and his friends are to him. And
Yeah.
that like is fundamental to his character. So
Yeah.
yeah, I he's good. He's a good pirate, and it's like what? And I started asking myself like, what does that mean?
Right.
And then in particular, in contrast with in this world, in this universe, we have bad Marines, right? The Marines are
Right.
supposed to be the law of the sea. There's a world government. I don't know that if there are any other nations beside the world government. That there are like individual kingdoms because there are kings and stuff, but I think they are all under the authority of the world government. So it's one central authority, and their
Right.
military arm is the Marines. And they purport to uphold justice in the world. In the Japanese, it's Seigi, and they
Mm.
literally have the word written on the backs of their uniforms.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. And
And
that gets in.
so
Sorry, go
go
ahead.
go on. Yeah, yeah, please.
I was gonna say, and that gets into all the questions of who gets to define what justice is, and
Mhm.
I think that's something we're gonna really talk about. I just want to hype. I just want to focus a little bit more first on this question of what do we mean by a pirate being a good guy, being a hero, or a good woman. I'm using kind of the media term "good guy" there because I think we do often get movies about pirates and even kind of you can say larger, criminals who are protagonists and are the people we root for, but are not necessarily heroes or heroic, and certainly not necessarily people we think of as like super altruistic. People like Jack Sparrow to take
Yeah, yeah.
specific pirates, or Blackbeard in movies where he's the focus, or to kind of pulling a wider lens, someone like The Godfather, or really the protagonist of most movies about sort of mafia types or criminal organizations where the one group that is our protagonist is kind of our hero, and we see them like that, they're maybe not as bad as all the others, or that we understand and sympathize with how they got pulled into this life of crime, but they're still not people we think of as like Captain America, moral paragon type things. Um, and so let's kind of get into this idea of what exactly do we mean by the word pirate? And Riki, I'm curious because I think one thing we also have to remember is that we're talking about pirate. Like I think, let's try that again. We're talking about the word pirate, it also has a number of different cultural contexts, I mean, today people use the word piracy to refer to like, Yemenis, sailors who are interfering with ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf down there, to people who download software that they haven't paid for, to copyright infringements, to I know a lot of people in the transgender movement who've talked a lot. I know a lot of transgender folks who talk to themselves about like gender pirates and all this kind of thing. And so there's so many different definitions of pirate for you. And I think one thing also is that we as English speaking people are talking about a language story, the live action that originally comes from a Japanese language anime that comes from a Japanese language manga. So Riki, as someone who has sort of grown up in both of those contexts, I'd love just to start from you. What does the word pirate mean to you?
So in the Japanese, pirate is translated as kaizoku,
Mhm.
which literally just means sea bandit. Like
Yeah.
that's the characters it uses, and then it contrasts with sanzoku is mountain bandit, which I guess
Mm.
is just like a land pirate, I guess, like or just we would call it a bandit. But it's like to me, like kaizoku and pirate are the same thing, and
Mhm.
and especially like in terms of One Piece, the visual aesthetics, the technological level of this universe are clearly based on like 1600 to 1700s like pirate era, like the golden age of pirates that we think of.
Right.
And so like in that context, like a pirate is someone who sails on the sea and basically like interrupts commerce
Mhm.
by stealing from other ships or from landing on an island or a coastal town and stealing from that town. And like the interesting thing for me is historically piracy I think would be something basically between nations. And of
Right.
course we get the more direct example of privateer who were state sanctioned or state sponsored pirates. Like
Right.
literally, like England would go to pirates and say, "Hey, we want you to work for us and only attack Spanish ships and
Right.
villages." And
Yeah.
so, in the context of One Piece, it's weird because there's only the world government. So yeah, like the pirates we would think of traditionally probably disrupt the commerce of the world government. Steal from them, fight their marines, and so like they are bad guys, villains from the perspective of the world government. So
Right.
what does it mean to be a good pirate? I think it's essentially pirates who take from other pirates.
Right. The idea that like you can
This,
steal or rob from other people who are doing harm, but
yeah,
you're not ever hurting innocent people, so to speak.
right, exactly. And that's a term that does come up a couple of times in the live action One Piece is innocent people. I think
Mhm.
Luffy has a conversation with Kobe, the young man who wants to become a Marine and eventually does. And they talk about innocence. Kobe's like, I want to be a Marine to protect innocent people.
Right.
And I think there's a conversation they have discussing a bad Marine. And Luffy's like, he's not protecting innocent people. It's like, you're right. Like he's not a good Marine.
Right. And Kobe,
And
we also learn from his first meeting, he has internalized this idea that pirates are inherently bad. At
yeah,
one point, he says, and when he's first met Luffy, and Luffy has said, "I want to be a pirate," and Kobe says, "Pirates are scum. They are thieves and murderers." And Luffy says, "Not the pirates I know." And I think
yeah.
so. From the very beginning, they're really trying to say, "This is not your grandfather's piracy. This is not the kind of piracy that people think of necessarily."
And there's like two instances where the idea behind a Luffy as a good pirate, I think, is defined as like what does he want? He wants
Right.
freedom and he wants adventure. And I think
Right.
those are also outlined kind of in the intro when they talk about Gold Roger. And it's like
Mhm.
it opened up an era of the age of pirates, of adventure and freedom.
Right.
And if you look at Luffy's mentor figure, Shanks,
Mhm.
he would be another example of a good pirate, right? The scenes we are shown,
Right.
he um, fights against in the manga. It's a sanzoku, it's a mountain bandit,
Mhm.
um, and saves Luffy and saves like the bartender of this bar that they frequent.
Right.
And he's never shown taking from the village that they stop at. And
Right.
in fact, it seems like they engage in like completely legal and up and up commerce with that like resupply there. But somewhere out there when they go out on their adventures, they're presumably stealing from someone. And
Right.
because he's presented as a good pirate, probably from other pirates, from bad pirates who have been taking from other people.
Right. And I do think he's not perfect about that, which is something we'll discuss later. But just sticking on this idea for a bit, one of the things that I think is really essential to this version of piracy is the idea of, what does it mean to have a moral code when the law of the land is actually not moral? And so that where, the difference between, do you follow the rules or do you follow your understanding of what you think is right, becomes really stark. And in that regard, and in that regard, one of the things that comes to mind for me, although the word pirate isn't really used very often, I think at one point they may describe themselves as such, is Malcolm Reynolds in the cast of Firefly, where for him, he has very similar desires. He wants to be free. He wants to be able to do his own thing, to do what he wants without someone else looking over him. And I think he is a little more morally gray than Luffy is, but a lot of it is the same. It's a very oppressive system that wants to tell people what to do and say you can do this and you can do that and nothing else. And he just wants to be able to do his own thing. Like keeping it in an American context, which is very much true of Firefly, but it's very much kind of think the romanticism of the Old West, or of, some of those other ideas that, you know, that at the end, every man is his own captain, every person gets to do their own thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that at least I have not really gotten out of One Piece is why the world government is so bad.
That's fair.
I think there have been hints of it being kind of, I believe there's like an aristocratic class who is shown to be like very classist and racist and oppressive. So
Right.
that's something that comes in later. But at least in terms of like right now, it's like, I don't know, like we identify with Luffy because he's the protagonist, and by extension, we kind of are supposed to hate the world government and hate the
Right.
Marines, right? Although we're presented, I think we're presented with good examples of Marines.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in this season, like we get bad Marines, we get Axe Hand, and then we get Nezumi is like bad Marines, and then Garp is presented as an example of a
Right.
good Marine. And I really love their interactions
Yeah.
because Garp is Luffy's. I mean, spoilers for the show, right? Garp is Luffy's grandfather,
Right.
and always wanted him to become a Marine and opposed him becoming a pirate because of his own code. But by the end of the season, like he sees that Luffy is honoring that code to some degree and
Right.
lets him go because of that.
Yeah. Part of how I saw it is that, I mean, I kind of saw it through a superhero lens, where often our hero is someone who has to go outside the law, in part because the actual government is either unable or unwilling to deal with the problems. And so our hero feels like they have to do it. And that can be everything from something where the government is fairly benign, to like Spider-Man, to something where the government is, outwardly corrupt, especially the law enforcement, like Batman. Both of those are criminals, but both of those are, to some extent or another, heroes. And I think I kind of saw, and again, I've only seen the live action. You, Riki, have much more experience of the manga and the anime. But I think I kind of saw the primary fault of the world government is that they're kind of like Jonah Jameson, or, Commissioner Gordon early in the story, in that they see Luffy and the much more evil pirates. Well, they're both breaking the law, so they're both equally bad. And when you talked about kind of the end, the change that Garp makes, to me, it feels a lot like what Commissioner Gordon goes through, of coming to understand in some versions of the story that someone like Luffy or Batman is acting outside of the law, but is not doing harm and is actually doing a lot of good in a lot of ways that they, the sort of more establishment law enforcement types, can't. And just to be clear, I want to say that like a lot of what I'm saying here is very vigilanteist. Some of I think how I'm describing Luffy is kind of libertarian. I'm not necessarily saying I'm in favor of all those things. I'm saying like this is, I think, the moral argument the show is making.
Well, yeah, I would absolutely classify Luffy as a libertarian, right? The idea of
Yeah.
freedom, like personal freedom. And then, but the way that he projects that, like with his power, is that he never uses his personal freedom and his strength as a fighter or as a pirate crew to oppress other people. And in
Right.
fact, he only uses his power to fight against oppressors, whether they are Marines or pirates.
Yeah.
And yeah, in terms of like what the world government is doing that's bad, I think what they're doing or that they're not doing is they're not handling the pirate problem.
Right.
Right? Despite everything, like their own forces aren't strong enough. So the character of Dracul Mihawk, the greatest swordsman, is
Mm-hmm.
called one of the warlords of the sea, the seven warlords, and he is essentially a privateer. He is
Right.
someone who has been contracted by the world government to hunt down other pirates.
Right.
And then on the
Well,
other side, you have the example of I mentioned Nezumi, the Marine, who basically takes bribes from, I mean, he takes bribes from Arlong, the
mm-hmm.
fisherman pirate, to turn the other way. And
Right.
so, like, that's a clear example of where the world government is failing. And then Garp comes along and finds all this corruption. And Luffy has,
Right.
like, dealt with the pirates and is like, you kind of did my job for me. So I'm going to let you go.
Right. Well, and this is, I think, really interesting because one of the questions that I kept coming up with is who gets to define who is a pirate? Because I was reading through a lot of the history, both in kind of the Western, like you talked about the golden age of piracy. And I think when we're talking about that, we're mostly talking among Western nations. A lot of it's in the Caribbean, a lot of it's off the coast of Spain and England. There is some of it, in the Far East, but mostly like the history of um, banditry and on the sea and stuff like that is in Japan and China. There's different words that are used. And there's a great article that I'm going to link to in the show notes about all that. And one of the things that when I was reading about, there's a word I'm not going to be able to translate it properly. I think it's wahoo in Mandarin, but it basically was a word that was used specifically to refer to, and because if you search for piracy in Japan, this is often what will come up first because it specifically was a Chinese word and then a Korean version of it for raiders who they associated with coming from the Japanese archipelago. And the article goes into how that often wasn't correct, and at times it was maybe only like 30% of the people were actually from Japan, and a number of things like that. But one thing it talks about a lot is that it would be the people who felt like they had been attacked would call people this word that is understood to be pirates or not sea bandit, the word you used. Um, and as an example, they talk about how like people who came as merchants, but then later people felt like they'd gotten a bad deal out of it, were often referred to as pirates and things like that. And so, kind of what I see happening in this world, looking at this lens of this question of who gets to define what a pirate is, it feels to me like what has happened is that there are people who are what we think of primarily as pirates in terms of the bad usage of that term. They are, raiding villages and stealing from other ships and hurting people and killing people, all of that stuff. The world government, in that sort of like, attacking a flea with a warhammer kind of idea, painting with a very broad brush, starts calling anyone who is not obeying the world government completely, who's thus, working for their freedom instead of their authority and is connected to the sea in any way, a pirate. And so for someone like Luffy, it almost feels like he's kind of reclaiming the word, like the way, like, a lot of like queer communities have reclaimed that word specifically, or other words like that, where it's like, yeah, I want to be free, and I've grown up learning that that means I'm a pirate. And so he's kind of like redefining the term in a lot of ways, and saying like I can be this. People were originally saying pirate means outlaw and bad person, but in this world where any kind of freedom is outlawed, then I can be a pirate too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Luffy is not just redefining the word, but he is redefining the world.
Right.
I mean, that's the scope of this character, ultimately. I mean, it starts off small, but I think it's gonna. I don't know how it's gonna end, but somehow, like he's going to come into conflict with the world government, right? Like, I don't know if he's gonna topple it or change it or just like beat their strongest warriors and walk away.
Right.
That seems like kind of maybe what he would do. It's like, yeah, I'm just gonna be your strongest warriors because you're impeding my freedom. And then once I defeat you, like I don't want to be king. Like he wants to be king of the pirates, but he doesn't want to be the king of the world.
Right.
He doesn't want to govern. He just wants to be on the sea.
There's another great article I read that I'll also link in the show notes called Freedom, Heroism, and the Definition of Pirate in One Piece by Sean Atchison. And I think he wrote it's on crunchyroll.com. And I think this was written before the live action. Certainly it's mostly talking about the um manga and anime. And he writes, to explore, to see new places and experience new islands, meet interesting people, sail to the unknown, eat new foods, make great friends. These are the things Luffy wants, and finding the One Piece and becoming king of the pirates is just the end point of his thirst for adventure and freedom. Luffy says as much in chapter 507, episode 400 of One Piece. Riley asks him if he can really rule as a pirate king, and Luffy responds with, I'm not going to rule anything. It's the freest person in the sea who's king of the pirates. And I really appreciated that because I think that is one thing that I was confused by the show because I could sort of get onto the idea of a pirate who is not our definition of pirate, but then I kept hearing him say, I want to be king of the pirates. And I would think, so does that mean you don't want any freedom for anyone else who's a pirate? Like, if you're a king, aren't you a ruler? Don't you have some authority over them? And so it's interesting that, again, it feels like he's saying it not in the king as in the actual ruling monarch of this world of piracy, but more like the way you can say, like, someone is the king of lightsaber sales, or someone is the king, it's to be the best, to be the epitome, to be the pinnacle of that particular thing. And that's what he means by king.
Yeah, the way I imagine him ruling is that he doesn't conquer anyone, but
Mm-hmm.
people follow him because they admire him so much, right? Like
Yeah.
that's how his character is built. That's how his crew has been built. Like he kind of forces them to be his crew at first. He's like, "You're gonna be on my crew."
I was gonna say, yeah, that, like, one of the freedoms he doesn't really believe in is the freedom of other people to say, no, we're not a crew.
But the conceit of his character is that he's always right,
Right.
and that's just something you have to accept. But it is also like he is right in an inspiring way. Like he inspires his crewmates.
Right.
He liberates their crewmates in some cases, like from their past shackles and trauma,
Yeah.
and helps them and says, I am going to support your goal if you support my goal, right? The Zoro's goal is to become the greatest swordsman. It's like, well, I'm going to help you do that, like, because you're my first mate. If you're not the greatest swordsman, you can't be my first mate.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's what I love about it, and that's what makes like this end goal of King of the Pirates kind of interesting. Because yeah, like obviously he's the protagonist. He's going to end up becoming King of the Pirates,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not going to be, as you say, like he's not going to be like this warlord who controls everything. He's just going to be out there still like the same person having a good time. And as long as you are having a good time and not, I guess, impeding other people from having a good time by stealing from them, he's okay with that.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting philosophical ethos, because if everyone follows that, we're good, right?
Right.
And in fact, we're bored because then there's no one left to fight. If no one is stealing from anyone, then the good guys don't have anyone to steal from and fight.
Right.
But we're never going to be in that idealized world. There will always be bad people for Luffy to fight, I think is
Right.
kind of the point.
And there's a lot there that I want to unpack because I think that that's both a lot of what I love about his character and also what kind of makes me fearful of him in the same way I'm fearful of libertarianism in general, as well as anyone who claims to believe that they know what is objectively right or wrong or good or bad, either in general or for specific people. But first, I am curious. We talked a bit about the word pirate. Talk to me about the word king in Japanese because I'm by no means an expert, but in my study of Japanese history, I often see reference to an emperor or other times a shogun or other kind of leaders. I've never seen much discussion of there being someone that is translated to king. And I'm just kind of
Hmm.
curious, like, uh, what is the word that do you know offhand what is the word that's used that he wants to be? And is it just kind of like the Japanese word for how you'd refer to Henry VIII, or is it something different? And kind of what's that concept like coming from a Japanese perspective?
Yeah, the word they use is kaizoku o, so kaizoku pirate, and then o is from o-sama,
Oh,
which is just king.
okay.
You're right. I cannot think of like a historical example where a ruler in Japan would have been an Osama.
Hmm.
So it could be a word that is just used to refer to outside nations' kings,
Right,
even though like it is a Japanese word. It's not like a word we took from, as far as I know, from another
right.
language because there's kanji for it. So yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about it that way, but yeah, o-sama, and the sama is just the suffix, the honorific suffix. So o is king. Um, I'm not really sure what to think
Yeah.
about that right now.
Yeah. Well, is there any question? And certainly, if other people are listening and they have more thoughts on this, write in, because certainly, I mean, just telling us that it is the Japanese word for king specifically does help, I think, a lot. And that it does tell me at least that king is an accurate translation there. But yeah, it to me, it's an important thing to think about how these things can be in such different contexts and stuff like that. Especially, because I think pirate is also a word that's like that. So let's get back to this idea of the philosophy of it. Of And again, pulling out the larger and then talking more specifically about Luffy. In general, how do you tend to react to characters who will say everyone else's idea of right and wrong is they don't understand. I know it's right and wrong, and so I'm gonna follow my own lead, do what I think is right, and if someone tells me I'm wrong, I'm not gonna let them stop me.
Sorry, what was the original question?
Oh, just your reaction to characters who have that kind of a perspective.
My reaction is that they they better be good.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I've mentioned Attack on Titan in the past with
Mhm.
you, but that protagonist just goes off the rails
Yeah.
and is like a bad, evil, I would say, evil character, and yet he's the protagonist. And I think that's what makes Luffy magical is that he has always been good. Like he's had some interesting quandaries and moments, but they are not related to him being evil or
Yeah.
bad, or they pertain to his lack of character as a captain. Like I think
Yeah.
that is the place where his ethics are questioned the most in his story.
Interesting.
Is that he does something that maybe hurts someone, like hurts a member of his crew, like emotionally,
Mhm.
sometimes physically, like they fight all the time. But he has to do it because that's the
Right.
captain's responsibility. And I think that's the most bad or evil like his character is portrayed as. And other than that, like he's just this paragon. And I think with a character like this, whose ethos is I just want to be free and I want everyone to be free, but just don't do bad stuff. Like
Right.
he has to be like almost perfect, right? Like
Right.
morally perfect. Otherwise, that doesn't work. Otherwise,
Right.
other people are not going to follow him willingly.
Right.
It's like, well, I kind of disagree with you on this, like type of thing. And
Or
it's very black and white, but I think
right.
it's done in a well written and beautiful way.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I see him a lot like Captain America. And that scene from Civil War in which
Yeah.
he says, even when everyone else says you're wrong, you're right.
Yeah.
You say you move. And I think I have kind of the same reaction to him that I have to Captain America, which is, yes, I believe that you are enough of a paragon of morality that I trust that you are going to be right most of the time. In Luffy's case, I think he actually he has some real sort of gaps in his moral wisdom that we'll talk about in a little bit. Cap, I think, is getting a lot better about that, and we've seen Cap's evolution about it in earlier movies. But part of why Captain America terrifies me when he says that, and I have a similar reaction, I think, to Luffy is, like you said, it's not only that the people who follow it. Well, let me start again. Like you said, the people who follow him have to be just as moral. or not even just follow him in terms of being part of his crew, but the other people who say, "Oh, Luffy can do whatever he thinks is right. Well, I'm going to do the same thing too." And yet, what they think is right is that they be well taken care of. So if someone has stuff that they
Mhm.
want, well, they should take it. You know, I think in many ways that's how I see Luffy is, and I'll grant also, I have a bias in that Luffy is portrayed in the live action, at least. And I don't think this is true in the other versions, as a kind of character that I don't think is bad or wrong, and I don't think people are bad or wrong to enjoy it. I personally don't find it pleasant to see on screen. The kind of super exuberance, the like yelling and screaming every time he does something good, the naming his moves, and the just like, yep, I've utter confidence. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I know I'm gonna do it. I just don't like people like that, either in person or or in uh the stuff I watch. So I have that bias, and that's my own bias. And maybe years of therapy will help me fix it. Who knows? But the actual failings that I think I see most often with Luffy, that I think I also see a lot, and this is where for me the libertarian comment comes in, is it feels like a lot of the time he's not aware of who he might be hurting. Because I think you're right, he wants to steal from bad people, he wants to steal from institutions and things like that. To give just one example, I think stealing food for subsistence, like, that's not something I'm ever going to come down on. But at one episode, he takes his crew into a fairly fancy restaurant and, orders a huge amount of food for he and his friends, and um uh orders, the most extravagant things on the menu, and he has no idea how he's going to pay. He's like, Just I don't have anyone to pay. What's the big deal?" And that
Well,
really
no, he
bothers.
says put it on my treasure tab, I think is the phrase they use.
Right, because he thinks he has this
Which is
idea that he's going to have all this money one day, and so everyone should believe him.
Yeah, which in
Um
theory, right? Like if you're a pirate and you frequently find treasure, then yeah, like, hey, I don't have any
sure,
right now, but I'm good for it, type
right.
of thing.
But that only works if anyone has any reason to think that he's good for it, and he doesn't.
Right.
And it's weird because he's very much not a person who has privilege, but I feel like he acts in a way as though he acts in a way that feels like he's been very spoiled and very entitled. In terms of, he always assumes everyone around him is going to be just as hopeful as he is, or even more important, that they're going to believe that. And to me, that's just stealing. Like, the restaurant seems like it's a decent place. Like, I mean, I'm not supporting big business here. But it's not like a huge chain that's oppressing people. It's just a restaurant with a pretty awesome guy who was the chef there, and the assistant chef. Um, so it's just one example, but I think that's the kind of thing where it felt to me like, for Luffy to make sense, he has to have, like you said, he has to have that perfect moral compass. And I felt like, at least in season one, he doesn't have that yet. And maybe that's the point, is he gets that, and that's awesome. But there's that. Another example to me is where we kind of joked before, we kind of talked a little bit before about how he tells everyone they're going to be on his crew. Um, and as you said, it's because he winds up being right, that is what they want. Well, maybe, or that he actually just has an incredibly strong personality and can talk people into anything. Because again, to me, when someone says, "I know what other people want better than they do, so I'm going to get them to do it," that that to me is not something that leads to good places.
Well, I think in terms of the way his character is portrayed or written, he does seem to have the perfect compass in terms of reading people.
Hmm.
Whether it comes to joining his crew or just punching their lights out. I can't remember if it's portrayed in this one, but I recall in my head something where he just like punches someone, and it's not even fully established yet that the person he punched is a villain. But it's like, what? Why did you do that? And he's like, I don't know. They bothered me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the manga side of it. Like, it's comical,
Right.
and they play his naivete to comedy a lot of the times. I want to go back real quick to what you mentioned about Captain America,
Hmm.
because it struck a nerve for me. I don't know, it struck a nerve, but it rang a bell for me when you compared Luffy to Captain America, right? the
Mm,
quote you said, and then in Civil War, the movie, his personal failing by the end of it is that he lied to his friend, Tony Stark, about Bucky being the assassin that killed his parents. And I think like what I mentioned about upcoming Luffy stories, like not going to spoil the specifics, but like that's his moral failing is like when he holds something back from his friends.
right.
And I think like I don't know, like that just made a very interesting contrast of like I never thought about Captain America and Luffy as parallels, I
Right.
guess. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, and I think it was awesome because, like, for me, I wasn't even thinking about that. I was thinking just of the conflict at the beginning of the movie where, it's this question of should someone have moral oversight or should ethical or legal oversight over the Avengers, and his position is no, we know best what to do. And, you know, um, and I've spoken a lot about Captain America and my own thoughts about it in other places. I don't want to get into that specifically, but I think you're right. I think what you're getting at there, I think, is maybe a better way of kind of pulling this back to the philosophy of it all. Of course, I love freedom. Of course, I love the idea of everyone getting to do exactly what they want. But, there's that old quote that the freedom to swing my arm ends when my arm hits your face. And I feel like the problem that I so often have with people like Luffy or libertarians or whatever you want to call it is how aware are they of the actual harm they're doing to others? And so I think that's why I kind of have a knee-jerk response of being very critical of it. And it even if it's an idea that like someone like Captain America or Luffy is that paragon who can do it, Luffy seemed to believe that everyone can do it. And that to me is just fundamentally wrong.
That everyone should be free. Is that what you're saying?
Free in the way that he thinks, in terms of like there isn't any overarching authority or structure of I I guess to me, where I kinda come and this is now kinda getting into political philosophy, but I think it's kinda where we're going with this whole show. I'm a strong believer that the idea of when does my freedom become an infringement on someone else's freedom is such a complicated question with so many things that any individual person might not see or might not want to see, and so many dangers of individual bias coming in that I tend to lean towards the side like, if the extremes are everyone decides for themselves and one world government decides for everybody else, both of those I think are awful, but I lean a little bit more towards community and societies and cultures coming together to help everyone understand what's the best way to see freedom is not infringing on someone else's freedom, rather than all being individuals like Luffy.
Yeah, I don't. It's hard to paint with such broad
Yeah.
brushes for this product. I mean,
Mhm.
because it's very simplistic, I think.
Right.
And for me, that's the point, and that's why I enjoy it.
Mhm.
I know like there are other things we talk about and watch where characters are more complicated and nuanced, and
Right.
that's interesting to discuss. Um, but again, like you have you the the narrative of One Piece is set up in such a way that you you have to have trust in Luffy, right?
Right.
And at least to now, to over like 1,100 episodes, that I believe that trust has not been broken.
Right.
Even though like there are moments where he struggles and fails, like I don't think the trust has been broken in terms of like the goodness of his character.
Yeah.
And that to me like is an important part of some I guess heroic journeys or heroic
Mhm.
narratives. And maybe this goes to like why Paul has such a problem with the Last Jedi and the way that Luke is
Mhm.
portrayed is that he feels like that some of that trust was broken by showing Luke despondent.
Right. Yeah, I think
Not necessarily like that he failed. Like I think heroic characters can fail, but that he turned his back on
right.
it. Like
Yeah.
that moment, I can understand. Like in this context now, I can understand like why that would feel like a betrayal of a character that has been built up as the hero.
Yeah. And I think you're all making very good points. And I want to say two things. One is, I do agree with you that in the specific world of One Piece, I do think we're supposed to just trust Luffy and also kind of see it as a like, we're not saying that someone like Luffy would work in our own world, but in this world where someone like Luffy can be such a moral paragon, but also where the government is so fundamentally authoritarian itself. And like you said, where the point is to have a fun story, not necessarily a perfectly morally complex and nuanced story. I agree with all that. I think I was more trying to say, well, but it's still an interesting question to take and apply to our own world and larger things like that. I think though, specifically with One Piece, and here again, I really want to hear from listeners. I wonder if I would have a very different perspective on this if I had grown up or just, at some point had a lot of experience of the manga or the anime. Because I feel like, and I rewatched the first 3 episodes just this morning, and it confirmed for me, I don't feel like the show ever gives me a reason to trust Luffy. Particularly because the first person he tries to free is Kobe. He meets Kobe very early on. Kobe is the kid who, as you said, wants to eventually become a Marine and does become a Marine. Kobe is the kid who wants to become a Marine, who he meets in the first episode early on. But at this point, Kobe is basically a pirate for Avina, I think is her name, Avita.
Alvida.
Alvita, thank you. And not by choice. He feels like he can't get away. He has to do these things or else he's going to get punished. He does not have freedom in this situation. But he also is very scared to challenge that freedom because he, I think, somewhat rightly believes that the consequences would be pretty dire. And so when Luffy comes along and just very cavalierly says, no, just be free. Just don't do that. That's fine. There's no problem. And then specifically kind of outs specifically almost outs Kobe in a way that Kobe has in no way consented to, and makes up like he extrapolates kind of what he thinks Kobe is thinking, but tells the pirate leaders like, oh yeah, Kobe was calling you stupid. He was, trying to piss them off and start a fight that Kobe wants no part of. To me, that's an incredibly reckless and that made me significantly not trust him because he winds up putting Kobe into lethal danger. And yes, because of the rules of comic book fighting and stuff like that, they wind up surviving. And maybe the point is that he just knew that would happen. And maybe that's where my failing is. I haven't read enough comic books because I just can't. To me, I am going to start a fight on behalf of someone else that puts them in danger because I'm so confident that I will win. And so they're not actually in any danger. It just doesn't work for me. Um, and there's other stuff like that. But I think that for me, that's the point is that I don't, by the end of it, I do have that trust. And so I'm very curious to see where a second season will go. But for most of this first season, I just don't trust Luffy the way you're saying you do.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that that is a central conceit of a lot of shonen stories is the OP-ness of the protagonist, especially in the beginning. Like One Piece, Dragon Ball, Bleach, like oftentimes these characters are like supernaturally stronger than just about everyone around them, and they kind of defeat the like average, villain pretty easily. And I think that's used to establish their power level and use that as a storytelling method for when the stronger villains show up. Like in this first season arc, Arlong the Fishman defeats Luffy initially in his fight, and that's kind of like a big moment. And then he has his rematch.
And Zoro loses a fight that shows he's not the greatest swordsman of the world. And I think we're almost guaranteed that Zoro is going to fight the same guy again at a later point.
Well, someday,
Yeah.
maybe the final battle like that. I don't think that's happened yet because that is one of the most interesting storytelling decisions I've ever seen. Is to have Zoro say, "I want to be the greatest swordsman," and then very early on, meet the person who is acknowledged as the current greatest swordsman,
Right.
and lose to him, right? That I can't think of another story where you just like immediately get the final boss like so in your
Right.
face, like final boss for Zoro at least.
Yeah. And I think is what made. I mean, I sometimes have this with main character syndrome and stuff like that. This is definitely a show where I really enjoyed every other character except Luffy. And Zoro, I think, was one of my favorites, possibly my favorite, in part because of that. Because I feel like whereas Luffy has this incredibly unfounded, no reason for it, hyper confidence, but because of his fighting ability and sheer luck and all these other things, he hasn't fallen yet. Zoro is the exact opposite. Zoro is someone who has incredible hubris and sense of himself, but he gets knocked down. And then the rest of the story is about him first getting back up onto his feet and not just saying, okay, well, I'm the worst, so I'm a failure, but also saying, no, I'm not the greatest yet, but I will be one day. And I want to work towards that.
That's interesting that you think of them so differently.
Mm,
Because to me, like they're the same.
yeah,
I guess what you're saying is like the difference is that Zoro has failed once,
right.
like in a major way.
Well, I think Zoro has
But
failed. More importantly, he's learned, he accepts that he has. Like,
but
like
they're
go ahead. Sorry.
but their characters are the same to me. Like they both have like this goal of the highest thing I can achieve within my career, my place, and I'm going to do that no matter what, and nothing's going to stand in my way. Like
Right.
that they have the same thing, right? I want to be the king of the pirates. I want to be the greatest swordsman in the world. Like those are the pinnacles of their things,
Right.
and it's different from like the other characters. Like Sanji wants to find the all blue,
Right.
which doesn't make him the great. He doesn't want to be the greatest chef in the world. He just wants to find this mythical place where all the ingredients and all the fish can be found,
Right.
and then to cook with those ingredients, which is still like a highly unattainable goal because no one else in this world is like, yeah, like
Right.
the all blue is this. Like they all think it's a myth.
Oh, but so interesting.
So
He doesn't say, so I can be the greatest chef in the world,
right,
the way
yeah.
that two of them do. Yeah.
But to me, like Zoro and Luffy are the same in their goals.
I think they really are. It's that I think that Zoro's confidence feels like it has a lot more basis in fact than just in pure hubris. And Zoro has learned a lesson. Like, I think if the end of that first episode had been Luffy saying to Kobe, you know what? I was wrong to think that I knew what was best for you. And I got us into a fight that I never should have gotten us into. And I'm sorry. And if you think it was best, and then got into the same place, if you think what's best for you is to be a Marine, you go be a Marine. And we'd seen him then be a little more cautious about telling other people what is best for them. I think I would like his character a lot more. And to me, then he'd feel a lot more like Zoro. It's that Z- Zoro had that moment of, there's a lot of jokes online about like, if only all of us had the confidence of the, you know, underqualified, the confidence of the underqualified basic male who thinks that he's so much better than he actually is. Um, that Luffy really hits that bone for me, in that there is no reason for him to have all this confidence, all this hubris, and when he's shown that he's wrong, he doesn't learn anything from it. And I think that's where I feel like him and Zoro are so different.
Okay, well, I think I disagree.
That's fair. That's fair.
And mainly like I disagree just because of the conceit of what a manga story is
Right.
that the main character in the end, by the end, will succeed 100% of the time, right?
Right.
So to me, like his confidence is not unfound. It's just kind of like comically accurate, and we're just waiting for the rest of the people to realize it.
Well, and like I said, I think for myself, not knowing much about manga, and also not having read it or seen any of that, I'm only going by what Netflix shows. And here again, listeners, I'd really love to know, more what you think. If other folks have only seen the live action, I'm curious. Are you closer to when I am, or are you closer to where Riki is? Because I don't know if I'm an outlier in that regard, or if this is something that, 'cause sometimes I think what can happen, certainly I think this happened with Ahsoka to a large extent, if you know a lot of the other versions of the story, it's easier to kind of fill in some of the gaps that people who aren't only seeing it for the first time in live action don't get to fill in. And so I maybe that, and it may well be that for the overall character, you're completely right. All I can talk about is just because that's the limited thing that I've seen.
Yeah, for me, like I just finished another series called Hunter x Hunter,
Uh-huh.
and again, like the main character Gon is a very headstrong, somewhat naive, but like very well-meaning, like this is gonna happen because like
Right.
it's what has to happen type of character. And there's actually like very interesting moments where he fails, but
Mhm.
every time he has that anime protagonist moment of like, we're just gonna do this. Like, yeah, I roll my eyes. I 100% roll my eyes, but I also believe they're just gonna do it.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. That makes sense. This maybe should the place I'm a curmudgeon. In the same way that like Paul is always yelling at me of like, no, it's comic book physics. Head injuries don't work that way in comic books and comic book shows. It's again where I have trouble believing it, but that's fair. We've been about an hour. I want to start wrapping up. So it's been about an hour. I want to start wrapping up. So Riki, let me just kind of pull us back to the original question. Having this discussion, I think we both agree that Luffy is a good guy. I think he wants to be a good guy. I don't think he's as good as he thinks he is, but I think we both agree that he's definitely not the malevolent pirate. He's not even the sort of, anti-hero. He's definitely a hero in this world. Do you think outside of this world, not necessarily like in our own world, although I think there's an interesting example in our own, but also like just in general, does a pirate have to mean a bad guy in other stories?
In other stories,
In other stories, our own world.
or like in the real world.
I mean, like, I'll give a real example. Right now, there are people in Yemen who ride out on boats with weapons to interfere with shipping that's happening in the area around like the South Arabian Peninsula. Um, we all call them pirates. To my knowledge, they have not killed anybody or not killed very few people, and most of what they're doing is interfering with shipping that's going to Israel because of their understanding of what's happening in that conflict. So to me, that's an example of like where people are labeled pirates, and I think many people can have a negative view of them. Some might have a more positive view of them. Um, uh, so I'm kind of asking for you, like either in our own world or just in stories in general, like what do you think of the central question? Can pirates be good guys, good people?
No, I'm gonna say no. My
Interesting.
like the way the definition of piracy is set up, it is literally like people who are breaking the law.
Hmm.
So to me, like that's not good. And then you have to ask the question of like, well, are the laws just? Are the people in power just?
Right.
And that gets more complicated. And I think you just have to go to like specific examples.
Hmm.
But it's uh I mean the and like the specific example you cite like is at a certain point like piracy is just war is it's just undeclared war in my opinion,
Yeah.
like historically too, like what we were talking about between England and Spain, like between those empires, they did also like declare war several times during that period.
Right.
But then like during the times of supposed peace, a lot of this fighting going on, the piracy, the privateering, was just those nations like trying to get at each other and like steal their resources and stop them from having bigger colonies.
Right.
and and like that gets into broader questions of like, are wars good? And like again, like no,
Right.
but specific examples of like why wars are being fought and like who's fighting them, it's complicated. But like I'm fairly comfortable just like on a broad basis just saying no, pirates are bad, piracy
That's
is
fair.
bad.
That's fair. I think for me, it really comes down to who's defining the pirate, and that I think by the strict definition of a pirate who is robbing and stealing for their own benefit, yeah, I think I'm with you. Pirates are bad. I think when we look
And
at it more from the perspective of who are other people defining as pirates, and that, you know, as definitely happens in this world, but I think happens in our own world, it is a lot of those kind of people, but also people who have much more, altruistic goals, or even just, what they think is justice for their own people goals, but are doing it where the law isn't perfect or where the authority is corrupt or things like that. Then I think there's a lot more grayness. So this was a great question. I'm really glad that you kind of brought this up with One Piece. I'm glad you encouraged me to watch One Piece. I think I'm coming off very negative because I really it's a philosophical question I really care about. But none of this is to say that I think One Piece is bad or wrong. It's just not one that I the central conceit is one that I don't necessarily wrap my head around. But that's not a critique of the show by any means. It's just
I
where I
mean,
come from.
to wrap up, going back to One Piece, I think even like Luffy's version of piracy, like stealing from people who've stolen from others, is wrong, right? And he does like a Robin Hood thing, like often of redistributing that wealth to the people who have been oppressed.
Uh-huh.
But if we look at his like end goal of like everyone's free, like, but don't steal from other people, right? Like if
Right.
that's the end goal and no one is stealing from other people, then Luffy, like I said, has no one himself to steal from. So I think
Right.
that kind of points to like on a very broad perspective that even his version of piracy is wrong. And once you reach the quote unquote perfect world, becomes
Right.
unnecessary.
Yeah. I mean, and that's drawing that comparison. Like I said before, Batman in a lot of the versions of the story wants to do enough to bring, the bad elements of Gotham under control that the actual government and police can, reestablish themselves enough that he's not needed anymore.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's
In the ideal world, Batman is not needed.
right.
It's the
Right.
idea that he's trying to reach but
Yeah.
never will.
And I think it
Because
also comes
that
down. Oh, sorry.
story will. I was just gonna say because that story will never end.
Right.
Right. That's the other thing about manga stories is that they do end, unlike American comics. So
Mm.
even though like Dragon Ball is trying to change that,
I was gonna say One Piece hasn't ended either, right?
One Piece hasn't ended, but there is an end. There's going to be an end. And Oda Sensei has started talking about it, like that we're getting close, and he's like
Okay.
finalizing his final ideas. What I was saying about Dragon Ball is that it ended and
Mhm.
then came back. So I
Right.
don't, and that's something we can talk about franchises in a future episode about why they never end, etc. But I'm not sure what's going on with Dragon Ball because
Right.
especially now that Toriyama Sensei has passed away, like who writes the stories, like who owns this
Right.
property, who controls this property, and what will it become is like I said, for a future discussion.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, Riki, thank you so much as always. This was a great conversation. To our listeners, thank you so much. As always, there's going to be bonus content for our members. We'll have a little bit extra after this episode. We're going to start doing bonus member full episodes here on Superhero Ethics. We've been doing them on Star Wars Generations. Please become a member. Only $5 a month, $55 a year. You get all those things, and you get to help support what we're doing. And it's just a great thing to be a part of. So please consider doing that. All the information is on our show notes and on our website, theethicalpanda.com. You can also find all this by just Googling The Ethical Panda or Superhero Ethics or my name, Matthew Fox, with those things. And you'll find our Twitter, our TikTok, our email. We love feedback. We always want more of it. Let us know what you think. We raised some questions here. I want to know what you all think of the answers. So please do all that. Please check out all the great things we're doing. And most importantly, we have spoken.
I'm gonna be the Pirate King.